Okay, welcome guys. So, not sure what I'm going to title this video yet, but I think this is important that I put this out there for people to understand the kind of historical information that exists behind the psychedelic movements of history, because there's a lot of just bad analysis floating around on the internet right now, according to my estimations. So my goal with this video is to correct that bad analysis and to give it a kind of more stable ideation of what the religious traditions really are at their core. So this video is going to be a roller coaster, man. If you are interested in psychedelics, if you are interested in religious history, if you're interested in anthropology, any of these things, this video is something that will probably interest you. But it's going to be a little bit dense. It's hard to get through, but trust me, there's a payout at the end of this. So I'm just going to run through off screen right here. I have a bunch of biblical verses and some references that I'm going to read through, and it's going to explain evidence for psychedelics being present within the Judeo-Christian tradition as well as within the Islamic tradition. This is information that I've never seen published anywhere, but it's all there in the primary sources. So I'm going to go through it, and I got some pictures I'm going to show you guys, and it's going to be pretty straightforward, but it changes the context of a lot of the social dialogue that's happening when you understand the information I'm going to present to you. So it's really worth it. If you're interested in what's happening in politics and philosophy, this video is really worth it. So hopefully, I mean, we got to go through it yet, but hopefully it'll be worth it for you. So I'm going to start off with Exodus. So at the time when Moses and the Israelites had left Egypt, okay, this is where my textual references are going to start, but I'm going to give a little bit of preface to that before we get into that, just really quickly. So how the Israelites got to Egypt is an interesting story. Now, it started with Abraham, right? That's what we call the Judeo-Christian tradition, an Abrahamic tradition, but even Islam falls under that same umbrella as Abrahamic, because the Prophet Muhammad traces his lineage to Isaac, who is one of the sons of Abraham, the one who was supposed to be slaughtered on the mountain, if you're familiar with that literature. So, Islam even falls under the Abrahamic monotheistic umbrella. Okay, it's important to know this going into this. So, I'm just going to give a little more background information. As far as so how did the Israelites get to Egypt? This is an important question. The Israelites traveled to Egypt after a certain event happened, and this is the story of the prophet Joseph. Okay, in Islamic tradition, they say Yusuf, we say Joseph in the West. Now, Joseph was put into a well by his brothers, and Joseph was the son of Isaac. I'm sorry, Prophet Muhammad was the son of Ishmael, not Isaac. I'm sorry. There's a lot of information here, and I'm just going to try and get through it as quickly as I can so that it's palatable for you guys. Now, Joseph was the son of Isaac, who was also called Jacob or Israel. God damn it. Fuck. Joseph was the son of Jacob. Jacob was the son of Isaac. That's what this is. That's what the lineage is. Now, Jacob was also called Israel. So the children of Israel are literally the descendants of Jacob. So what happened? Jacob, or Israel, whatever you want to call him, had something like 10 sons or something. And one of them was Joseph, who, as we know through biblical tradition, was the seer who interpreted the dreams of the Egyptian king at the time, and he has a very interesting story. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but essentially what happened was his brothers threw him into a well out of jealousy, because their father really loved him a lot. And what happened was traders picked him up out of the well, and Joseph was sold into slavery by his own brothers. Okay? Joseph made a journey to Egypt, and he was trained by the priesthood, essentially, of Egypt at the time, and became kind of noble. He was then accused of committing adultery with the wife of one of the nobles in Egypt, and was sentenced to jail. Eventually someone remembered that he knew how to interpret dreams, and he was summoned as a king's kind of vizier. He was a spiritual figure within the Egyptian government, and orchestrated the salvation of grain for about 7 years, and that brought them through a famine. This is recorded in the Bible. Okay, so Joseph has a very interesting story. Eventually, Joseph invites his family from Canaan, which is where Jacob and Abraham are from Canaan, to come to Egypt. And those brothers all their father Jacob came to Egypt, and they settled in Egypt after Joseph was brought to slavery there. And they were welcomed by the Egyptian ruling class at the time, because Joseph was very well respected for essentially saving the people from a famine. So they were welcomed kind of in a royal regard. So for a couple hundred years, they had many wives, children, and likely established kind of like a small dynasty within the Egyptian government. But it got to a point where the Egyptian ruling class thought that the Israelites were gaining too much power. The sons of Israel, the sons of Jacob, were gaining too much power in their government. And so they were put into slavery to build the pyramids, or maybe not the pyramids, but other architectural feats. There were civilization. Egypt was one of the biggest civilizations of its time, and so they were brought into slavery and hardship, essentially. And they were in a kind of foreign place, in a foreign land. It wasn't their home. Canaan was their home, right? Which is the region of present day, like northern Saudi Arabia. That's the region of Canaan. Now, what eventually ended up happening was the conditions of oppression became so bad that they had to leave. And Moses' story goes through this whole process of Moses kind of coming to an awareness of his relationship to the people of Israel, and then eventually leading them out of Israel and kind of removing themselves from this state that was oppressing these people. So they left Egypt, and you know the story, parting the Red Sea. They crossed. It's an interesting story. I'm just trying to get through to where the research picks up. So they crossed the Red Sea, and they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And this is where something very interesting happens. This is where we see evidence for psychedelics within the Abrahamic tradition as clear as we're probably ever going to see it. And there's the burning bush motif that's referred to by a lot of people, but there's better information about the psychedelics within the tradition. That's one piece, but there's better information. So that's what we're going to get into. And I'm going to read you a verse of Exodus right here. Okay, and all of my references are coming from the King James Version of the Bible. Well, most of them. I think one of these in here is from a different version, but the King James Version. Okay? So, and it came to pass that even the quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay round about the host. So this is a description of one of their encampments outside of in the wilderness of Canaan, essentially, after they had crossed the Red Sea into present-day Saudi Arabia. Probably a different climatic situation there. This was 4,000 years ago or so, maybe maybe a little bit more. So there's dispute about the exact dates, but maybe a different kind of situation where the climate was different. This is 4,000 years ago. It's hard to say exactly what it would have looked like. But this is the description that we are getting from the Israelites. And it came to pass that even the quails came up, quails meaning fowl or birds, and covered the camp. And in the morning the dew lay round about the host. And when the dew that lay was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness there lay a small round thing, as small as the hoarfrost on the ground. So something small and round and attributed to hoarfrost was laying on the ground. And when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, It is manna, for they wist not what it was. And Moses said unto them, This is the bread which the Lord hath given you to eat. And this is Exodus verse 16. And this is the verse of the manna. Okay? This is the thing which the Lord hath commanded. Gather of it every man according to his eating, an omer for every man according to the number of your persons. Take ye every man for them which are in his tents. So the leaders of families and houses would go up and gather an omer of this substance and bring it back to their tents for all the people, for every man particularly. And the children of Israel did so and gathered, some more, some less. Everyone kind of took what they needed. When they did meet it with an omer, he that gathered much had nothing over, he that gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to what they were taking, what they were eating. And Moses said, Let no man leave of it till the morning. Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto Moses, but some of them left it until the morning, and it bred worms. So the substance began to rot and stink, and Moses was wroth with them. They gathered it every morning, every man according to his eating, and when the sun waxed hot, it melted. So this substance melted in the heat of the sun. And the house of Israel called the name thereof manna, and it was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. And Moses said unto Aaron, Take a pot, and put an omer full of manna therein, and lay it out before the Lord to be kept for your generations. The children of Israel did eat manna for 40 years until they came to a land inhabited. They did eat manna until they came into the borders of the land of Canaan. Okay, I'm going to give you a rundown on what is manna. This is it. So, this is the foundation of a legal argument for the protected use of psilocybin mushrooms by anyone who subscribes to the Judeo-Christian or Islamic faith. It's all substantiated by this text here. A legal argument for making psychedelics a protected substance, in the same way that peyote is protected for Native Americans who are part of the peyote church in the southwestern Americas. Okay? Alright, so in this verse we see that okay, so this is a nomadic period. Israelites are wandering through the wilderness. They find this thing. Now I'm going to show you some pictures. So this is Bdelem here on the screen. Bdelem has a there's another verse that says that manna was also the color of Bdelem. So I'm going to go to the next image. Let's see here. This is coriander seed. Okay, fresh coriander seed, which was mentioned. So something small and white, the smallest coriander seed. So this is what coriander seeds look like. This is the color of coriander seed, which is maybe another reason why I'll get to it in a second. Coriander seed in order to scale. They're very small round seeds. This is mycelial primordia. Now mushrooms colonize substrates by spreading this network of organic material through it, and once it kind of gets a hold on a substrate and can suck the nutrients out of it, the surface of the mycelium starts to form these circular bulbs that you're seeing on the screen here, and these bulbs grow into mushrooms referred to as primordia or hyphal knots. This is the primordia at a later stage of development. You can see small as coriander seed. This is very very small, really probably the size of your fingernail or smaller in a lot of cases. There's some very tiny pieces in here. So something small, okay? Now, this is a picture of a fruiting body of psilocybin mushrooms, fruiting bodies within substrate. And beneath them, you can see that there is this kind of white substance, kind of frosty looking, don't you think? Remember that verse about hoarfrost? Now, this is an image of hoarfrost. Specifically, in hoarfrost was used by the people who translated the King James Version. It's a form of archaic English. Now they just say frost, but, this particularly this kind of frost that was referenced in the scripture. Another picture of hoarfrost, and another picture of hoarfrost. Okay, so let me just read that verse one more time, where we are seeing hoarfrost referenced. When the dew that lay was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness there lay a small round thing as small as the hoarfrost on the ground. There was hoarfrost on the ground, but according to them, but really, what was it? This is what it was. It was the mycelial networks of the psilocybin mushroom. Again, mycelium. Doesn't look too different from that, does it? Mycelium. Pretty interesting. This is a fully colonized tray before the primordia has begun forming. Alright, we're going to get to the rest of that in a minute. Now, mushrooms require conditions of moisture to grow. So the dew being about the host, which is about the campment of the Israelis who were living in the wilderness at that time, is a reference to the environmental conditions that would have made the growth of psilocybin mushrooms totally feasible, because mushrooms require a lot of moisture to grow. And when the sun would wax hot, what would happen? The mushrooms would melt, right? They melted. This is exactly in alignment with the conditions that are necessary for growing mushrooms. They can't be too hot, and direct sunlight quickly destroys these mushrooms. They need to have a moist and semi-dark condition. Exposure to direct sunlight and heat is not good for growing mushrooms. Okay. So I think that's covering most of it. Okay, and so the coriander seed could also be referring to the dried seeds that we saw. So it could, when we look at the fruiting bodies, we can see that this brownish color that we're seeing here is very similar to coriander in its dried state. So it's probably another reason why that was chosen as a descriptor by the Israelites, who found this bizarre-looking organic substance and essentially what supplemented their diet, because they were essentially nomadic people herding cattle and sheep and goats, and they didn't have a lot of natural food sources because they didn't have agriculture. And they had something like 140,000 people. It's a lot of mouths to feed without any system of agriculture. So they were likely slaughtering animals, and like they said, they had quails, they had a lot of fowl in the region that they were able to eat in order to survive for their 40 years that they spent outside of Canaan in the wilderness. And this is bdellium. Later we'll see this referenced as the coloration of manna, which you can see, there are darker colored caps. Some of these are lighter. But that kind of goes through the very foundational argument. So now, that's just the foundation. As we continue going through this, we're going to see a very different understanding of the Abrahamic tradition. So I'm going to give you this verse concerning the anointing oil. This is Exodus 30, verse 22 through 27. Now, this is an argument for cannabis as being a part of the traditions of the ancient Israelites. So, moreover, the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Take thou also unto thee principal spices of pure myrrh, 500 shekels, of sweet cinnamon half so much, even 250 shekels, and of sweet calamus 250 shekels, and of cassia just lost my place. And of cassia 500 shekels after the shekel of the sanctuary, and of oil olive a hin. So basically, this is an instruction to create a certain mixture of plant materials that were put into an oil mixture. Thou shalt make it an oil of holy anointment, an ointment compound after the art of the apothecary. This isn't. It shall be an holy anointing oil. So, an apothecary is someone who brews natural materials into perfumes or into intoxicating drinks. Okay. So, and thou shalt anoint the tabernacle of the congregation therewith, and the ark of the testimony. Okay. Now, the exact ingredients of this mixture are somewhat disputed. So, calamus is disputed. Now, calamus would be like a kind of Egyptian common grass that would grow within Egyptian society. But the original Hebrew translation is a term called kanebosem. That's what is written in the Hebrew Torah, not calamus, kanebosem. And if you know anything about Hebrew, the em denotes a plurality at the end of anything. So Elohim means actually gods. And that's what's used to refer to the Lord in all of the Old Testament. It's Elohim. It means gods. So cannabosum has been disputed as an identification for cannabis. So cannabis plural, cannabos m. Pretty straightforward. It's very possible that we could have received our linguistic root for the term cannabis from cannabos or cannabosem. So, in theory, this could be a dermally applied salve. Now, this was always poured over the heads of the high priests that worked within the tabernacle, and it was poured over everything as a kind of purifying agent. It would have smelled very good, like cinnamon and like myrrh, if you know what those smell like. It's kind of an aromatic, purifying smell. So it would have kind of been a perfume which would have been very pleasant to the people of the time because they're living in the wilderness and probably, shitting and eating and, not taking showers and, and so you can imagine that things could get pretty grody pretty quickly living under those conditions, especially if it's happening for 40 years. So this was a big thing about cleanliness. But if cannabis was involved in this salve may have been used as a kind of physical therapy similar to what we see with hemp oil today. Hemp oil is applied to sore areas on the body and is said to actually have some medicinal properties that the skin can absorb. The CBDs, not necessarily the psychoactive THC component, but the CBDs, and even CBDs do have a kind of psychoactive effect in that the CBDs have a reputation for calming anxiety, and there's some possibility for use of CBDs in treatment of depression, anxiety. So there's some interesting medicinal qualities to this notion of a dermally applied cannabis. Now, applying it to the head is very interesting because what's happening there is you're getting it on your temples, which you have some major arteries happening by your temples, and so all of that blood, or all of this anointing oil would have been absorbed through the face directly into the bloodstream and be in relatively close proximity to the brain. So you're delivering the CBDs through the blood directly to your brain. And so you might have had semi-psychedelic states from taking this substance because of how quickly these CBDs would be getting to your brain. It would have probably had some kind of a noticeable effect on the psychic space of the people who were utilizing this and pouring it over their head. Okay, so that's one piece. I have a verse about the golden calf, but I'm going to skip over that for now. But there's an interesting parallel about idolatry in here, but it's not really related to psychedelics, so I'm going to keep this psychedelic related for now. Okay, so just again, I'm going to go through a bunch of verses. Numbers 11, verse 6 through 9. But our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all beside this manna before our eyes. And the manna was as coriander seed, the color thereof as the color of bdellium. Bdellium being that substance we saw earlier. There, bdellium. The color thereof is the color of bdellium. And when the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell upon it. So every time the dew, this mist, came upon the camp, manna would follow it. So conditions of moisture are set in place for the growth of psilocybin mushrooms, and they just pop up everywhere. And yeah, and mind you, they had the cattle with them and everything, so there would be lots of substrate all over their camp in the manure of these animals to pop up and grow. It's just totally sensible. Okay, Deuteronomy 8:3, verse 3, and we're going to do verse 16. So, and he humbled thee and suffered thee to hunger and fed thee with manna, which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that he might make thee know that man doth not live by bread only, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live. So, they found this strange substance, manna, and it was kind of a staple in their diet, and it helped them to survive their time in the wilderness, because it was just this very abundant, growing food source. And it says, thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know. So this was very mysterious to them. They didn't know what this was. So again, in 16, who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee, and that he might prove thee to do thee good at thy latter end. This is an important verse. That he might humble thee is pretty much an explicit reference to ego death, which anyone who's taken psychedelics knows about what this experience is. It's this humbling force that psychedelics kind of bring you into a state of like total humility. So the fact that manna is referenced like this, like it's a food that makes you humble. You know, what other foods do that? You know, you don't eat corn and automatically think, oh, I'm so, so humbled by this amazing food. It's just like you just eat corn. It's like, oh, that's pretty good stuff. This is something else. Manna is something else entirely. It is a psychedelic drug. That's what it is. Okay, so that he might prove thee to do thee good at thy latter end. This is implying the ordeal, the shamanic ordeal that is common within anthropological literature of prehistoric cultures. Whether it's Native Americans who would fast or go on vision quests into the wilderness with no resources or food, and they just starve themselves. And maybe there's other traditions where they tie themselves up and stay in one position for days on end, suffering intentionally to earn some kind of wisdom or insight. So that he might prove thee to do thee good at thy latter end. There's a kind of challenge implied with this substance, that he might prove thee. And about this challenge somehow makes something better for you in the long run. This humbling makes you better in the long run. These are all motifs that align perfectly with psychedelic drugs. Perfectly. Yeah, so these ordeals can be genetic psychosis, drug-induced psychosis, starvation, pain. All of these things are forms of shamanic ordeals. Joshua 5, verse 12, and the manna ceased on the morrow after they had eaten of the old corn of the land. Neither had the children of Israel manna any more, but they did eat of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. So this is when the Israelites started conquering the tribes in Canaan and conquering their cities and taking their cities. So this is noteworthy because we have the Israelites stopped eating manna, but they ate the fruit of the land of Canaan. Okay, so that means the agricultural crops of Canaan. They now had access to agriculture, and they didn't need to subsist their diet with psychedelic drugs anymore. They had access to grain. which was probably a little bit less psychologically agitating than psychedelics would be, and probably preferable to them in a certain extent. And we're going to get into that in a little bit. Okay. There's a few I'm just going to skip. Okay, so Psalms is very interesting because this is where we have a Levite who was appointed by David by the name of Asaph, referencing manna. Okay, and he had rained down manna upon them to eat, and he had given them of the corn of heaven. So again, we're seeing this is the corn of heaven. This is the food of heaven. This isn't just normal food. It's not just normal corn. It's the corn of heaven. You know, and this is a Levite priest who would have been a keeper of the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant and part of the sacred traditions and all of these literary traditions that we are reading right now, mentioning manna. And so he probably knew what manna was. So for him to say that it was the corn of heaven is telling. And we're going to get into why he would have known in a second. Ezra, then I had pity upon your mornings and gave you manna to eat. So you did eat angel's bread. Again, angel's bread. Divine, unearthly. Angel's bread. This isn't just normal bread. Bartholomew 1, verse 10. And they said, Behold, we have sent you money to buy you burnt offerings, and sin offerings, and incense, and prepare ye manna, and offer upon the altar of the Lord our God. Manna is referenced all throughout the Bible, all the time. It's important. It's a very important piece of the Israeli tradition. Okay, I'm going to get back to this in a second. Okay, I'm going to stick with the Old Testament for a little bit, but we're going to get into the New Testament pretty soon. So, which had the golden censer and the Ark of the Covenant overlaid about. Okay, so Hebrew 9, verse 4. So describing the tabernacle, they say, there was a golden pot that had manna, and Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant, which is the Ten Commandments, written in stone. All this was kind of held in this sacred area. Okay, so now later King David is going, so this golden pot that had manna is important. So we have another verse where there's another verse that will reference this further down the line here that shows that Moses decreed that a pot of manna would always be placed next to the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, so this golden pot that would have had manna would have been like a reminder of what manna looks like, how to identify it, and this source of this sustenance of the Israelites, and a source of kind of their communion with God, and it was some holy bread. Okay, so anyone who would have interacted with the Ark of the Covenant, our Levite priest Asaph, would have probably known what manna was. They probably had a pot or some either that was preserved from the time of Moses, or that was a completely new substance, and it was constantly being replenished, which is probably more likely that a pot of manna would always be replenished near the Ark of the Covenant, and it would always be there. So there would always be psychedelics for the high priests to take. So this golden pot filled with manna. Now this is important because later King David will perform a ritual dance before the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, so King David had the Ark of the Covenant. He would have known about the manna tradition because the Levite priests knew about it. This isn't just something that Moses did. This is something that King David did and King Solomon, which is we're going to get to soon. Okay, I'll get back to that in a second. All right, we'll get to this King Solomon right here. So Proverbs 20. Now this is our secondary botanical identification of psilocybin. So Proverbs 20, verse 30. This is another very important verse. Now you will only see this translation in the King James Version, which is the original English translation of the Bible, the first English translation of the Bible that was widely printed and widely distributed. So Proverbs 20, verse 30. The blueness of a wound cleanseth away evil. So do stripes the inward parts of the belly. This is a direct reference to psilocybin but cryptically, so that only the Levite priests and the people who had seen manna in the wilderness would know what it is. Okay, so he's saying the blueness of a wound cleanseth away evil. I'm going to show you a picture here. Now, psilocybin, when you pluck it from its source, its mycelial root structure, bruises blue when you touch it, the psilocybin oxidizes and creates this chemical reaction that causes a change of color. And the mushroom turns blue. It really just like cutting it or pinching it anywhere will cause this process to happen. So usually at the root you'll see it when you pick it from the mycelium. Here is more evidence of this. Blue, right? You've seen this, it's lighter color, but you see the blue there. Another one, this is darker. So the higher the blue, or the darker the blue is, the more psilocybin content the mushroom has. And these are darker caps, but these are psilocybin mushrooms. You know, again, evidence here for bdelum. So we have that. The blueness of a wound. So whenever you cut or bruise these mushrooms, they turn blue. The blueness of a wound cleanseth away evil. That's what Solomon says in Proverbs verse 20, chapter 20, verse 30. Here we have more psilocybin with this light bruising. Okay? So do stripes the inward parts of the belly. These are the gills of psilocybin mushroom. Inward, on the underside of the mushrooms, you'll see these gills, you'll see these stripes. This is a direct reference to psilocybin. Solomon was taking psilocybin mushrooms, and this is an inherent part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. This is what the prophets and the divine kings of the Israeli tradition were doing. They were taking these substances. Okay. All right. Now we're going to get a little bit into the New Testament. There's a lot less evidence in the New Testament. New Testament is a difficult text to analyze because it's not so much of a primary source. And we only really see these texts rise like 60 years after Christ's life, so it's very difficult for us to even prove that any of this is real, but these texts are interesting regardless. So I'm going to go through John chapter 6, verse 31 through 69. It's a wordy verse. It's a little bit irritating, but just bear with me. There is a point to be made here. All right. So our fathers did eat manna in the desert, as it is written. He gave them bread from heaven to eat. So again, this starts with manna. Okay? Then Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, Moses gave you not that bread from heaven, but my Father giveth you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he which cometh down from heaven, and giveth life unto the world. Then said they unto him, Lord, evermore give us this bread. And Jesus said unto them, I am the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall never hunger, and he that believeth on me shall never thirst. But I said unto you, that ye also have seen me, and believe not. All that the Father giveth me shall come to me, and him that cometh to me I will in no wise cast out. For I came down from heaven, not to do mine own will, but the will of him that sent me. And this is the Father's will which hath sent me, that of all which he hath given me I should lose nothing, but should raise it up again at the last day. This is the will of him that sent me, that every one which seeth the Son and believeth on him may have everlasting life, and I'll raise him up at the last day. The Jews then murmured at him, because he said, I am the bread which came down from heaven. And they said, Is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How is it then that he saith, I come down from heaven? But he also says, I am the bread which came down from heaven. He's saying that I am the manna. That's what he's saying. All right? Shout out to John Allegro here and Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. He is saying, I am the bread which came down from heaven. Jesus therefore answered and said unto them, Murmur not among yourselves. No man can come to me, except the Father which hath sent me draw him. And I will raise him up at the last day. It is written in the prophets, and they shall be all taught of God. Every man therefore and hath heard and hath learned of the Father cometh unto me. Not that any... So he's saying, I am the mushroom. Every man therefore that hath heard and hath learned of the Father cometh to me, unto me. Christ in this moment is performing a kind of Gnostic speech. He is personifying the psychedelic mind. He is personifying the mushroom mind, the mind under the influence of these drugs. He is personifying this, and he's saying, look, you don't need the drugs. All you need is to have a relationship with me. I took these drugs, and my consciousness has been altered by them. All you need to do is have a good relationship with me. You don't have to eat of the manna. You don't need it. That's what he's saying in the earlier verses. You just need to have a good relationship with me. That's all. That if you have a good relationship with me, it means that you have a good relationship with the manna, because Christ was an egoless figure who was a sole representative of this psychedelic consciousness that sits underneath all of nature. This is what Christ is preaching here, and they're saying, how could, the Jewish people at the time, the Pharisees, were saying, how can we accept this? How can we accept that you are some bread that came down from heaven? Are you not just some normal dude who was born to Mary? We thought you were just normal. And he's saying, well, actually, because of this kind of psychedelic initiation, I'm not. That's what Christ is saying. It's very interesting. Okay. He that believeth on me hath everlasting life. I am the bread of life. I am the manna. Again, your fathers did eat manna in the wilderness and are dead. This is the bread which cometh down from heaven, that a man may eat thereof and not die. He is talking about manna. It's just that in those times, they were under Roman occupation, and the Jewish community had lost the understanding of manna. They had lost the tradition of manna, because the Israelites stopped. Remember, they stopped taking manna after they came into Canaan and got access to agriculture. So this is... So I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If any man eat of this bread, he shall live forever. And the bread that I will give is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. He is saying, and this is a kind of prophecy about his own death and his crucifixion, and that his death will be a symbol of this kind of divine consciousness within psychedelics. He was ahead. Make no mistake about it. Christ was ahead, and I'm going to get into more information about it. The Jews therefore strove amongst themselves, saying, How can this man give us flesh to eat? Then Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, except ye eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, ye have no life in you. The Son of Man. This is... So he's not really talking about himself. He's talking about... He's talking about this principle that he's representing, the Son of Man. And he's doing it in this very cryptic way that's supposed to agitate the Jewish scholars and to kind of get a rise out of them and get a response and a reaction, because he's trying to form some kind of kingdom and dynasty formed on the basis of these older Israelite traditions, which he would have known. So whoso eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood, he hath eternal life. For my flesh is meat indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He that eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood dwelleth in me, and I in him. As the living Father hath sent me, and I live by the Father, so he that eateth me, even he shall live by me. So he may be personifying the mushroom, saying, you have to eat it. You who eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood dwelleth in me, I in him. He's talking like he is a mushroom. He was so tripped out on these drugs that that's why this shit makes no sense. He was so tripped out on drugs that he's just talking just total craziness, where he's like the personification of this mushroom, and he's saying all these things. It's totally bizarre. It's totally strange. This is that bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers did eat manna and are dead. He that eateth of this bread shall live forever. These things said he in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum. Many therefore of his disciples, when they had heard this, said, "This is a hard saying. This is hard to hear. Who can understand this?" Everyone's saying, "I don't get it." You know. And then Jesus knew in himself that his disciples murmured at it. He said unto them, Does this offend you? What and if ye shall see the Son of Man ascend up where he was before? The Spirit that quickens, the flesh profit nothing. The words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life. So he's speaking totally in spirit. He's not saying things literally, like you got to eat my actual body. But he's not speaking in a way that anybody could at that time would have understood him. And at the same time, he was obfuscating this kind of occult secret that he had discovered, so that for the sake of maintaining its mystery, because it's hard to discuss these substances. There's nothing very easy for explaining what psychedelics are. So this is Christ essentially struggling to give a trip report. I mean, as far as I can tell, that's what's going on here. But there are some of you that believe not, for Jesus knew from the beginning who they were that believed not, and who should betray him. He said, Therefore said I unto you, that no man can come unto me, except it were given unto him by the Father. And many disciples left him after this. From that time, many of his disciples went back and walked no more with him. Then said Jesus unto the 12, Will ye also go away? Simon and Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? Thou hast the words of eternal life. And we believe and are sure that thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. So Christ is very much fetishized by the Christian community. Look, he knew the secrets of the ancient Israeli tradition, and he participated in them, obviously. I mean, who could say things like this without being stoned out of their gourd? Seriously. Who could say things like that without just being higher than a motherfucker? Jesus was getting very, very, very high, and people could not understand what he was saying, and that's ultimately why they killed him. They just didn't get it. And what he was trying to say in some capacity, he was trying to say, look, I am the mushroom, draw near to me, eat of my flesh. There's this whole symbolism that even still, we don't know how accurate these texts are. We don't know how much of this is just paraphrasing, how much of this, it's not like a primary source. So the Christian tradition is very hard to analyze, as I said earlier. But that's one verse where we see Jesus kind of personifying himself as a mushroom, as the manna, which is very clearly, according to the previous identification that we've done, is psychedelic mushrooms, very clearly. So for him to personify himself as a manna is very telling. It's very meaningful, because why would he do that unless he knew what it was? Right? And he was using this to kind of as an agent of reform within the Judaic tradition. Like, he's preaching to Jews in this segment, and he's saying, I am the manna of ancient Israel. I have embodied this consciousness that they had. All you have to do is follow me, and that's all that you need to do. You don't even have to eat of the manna. Eat of my flesh, just understand me. I think that's what the core of the message is. That's my interpretation. So Revelations, which was also written by John, is an interesting verse. They mention manna in Revelations. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. To him that overcometh will I give to eat of the hidden manna, and will give him a white stone, and in the stone of a new name written, which no man knoweth, saving he that receiveth. So the stone thing, whatever, it can mean anything. But the hidden manna, this is reference to the fact that the Jewish scholarship had lost the understanding of what manna was. It had become hidden. It had also become a part of an occult practice. It had become hidden as a means to protect it from being put into the hands of the corrupt priest class of the time. So, and there's also rumors that John, who had this vision on Patmos, there's rumors that this island is filled with psychedelic mushrooms. I don't know if that's true, or maybe it was true at some point, but those are rumors. It's a common rumor that has been circulating for some time. I remember hearing it more than 10 years ago when I was in school. regular public school. People would use it, obviously, as a means to discredit the Bible as psychotic rambling. But really, these drugs influence the cognitive ability of people who take them. There's some deep meaning behind these drugs, and we're going to get into that a little bit more in a minute. Okay, so I'm going to go over one more verse from the Old Testament that is also very telling. So Numbers 11, verse 1 and 3. And when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, and the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled. So this is the time when the Israelites are in the wilderness, and they are complaining about the manna. They don't like it. They don't like the psychedelic drugs that they're eating because they are getting very psychologically agitated by these substances. They are causing a difficulty in them, and they said, we don't like this food. We want to go back to our old food. We want to go back to Egypt. Why would you bring us out of Egypt to eat this cursed food that is horrible? And it's not just that it tastes bad, it's that it's psychologically punishing them in some capacity, and it's difficult to deal. Again, going back to the ordeal language from the earlier scripture. Okay, so when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, and the Lord heard it. And his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burnt among them, and consumed them that were in the uttermost parts of the camp. And he called the name of the place Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burnt among them. What is the fire of the Lord? My belief is that it is a mass psychosis that spread throughout the camp. That is what this is. There's some kind of mass psychosis spread throughout the camp for whatever reason because of the taking of these drugs. My view is that they were in some way, they were lost. They didn't have direction. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know where their home would be. And so this kind of void of purpose, this void of reason to be, left the Israelites with an existential crisis. An existential crisis that would have been amplified by these drugs in a kind of maddening degree. And that is what the fire of the Lord is. It is this movement of this psychic spiritual energy through their community of just total madness and insanity, and just like an inability to sit calmly, to be at peace. There is an agitation moving through their camp. So it's an interesting piece of the text there. Okay, so I'm going to just go on a little bit more about the culture of the Israelites, where we see, just very briefly, I'm just going to paraphrase this because it's too long. So King David is reported to have danced before the Lord with all his might, okay, in 2 Samuel verse 6, 14 through 15. And this was done in front of the tabernacle, or in front of the Ark of the Covenant, as it was being moved to a new location. So again, it's just, he's dancing, he's in this psychedelic trance state. He's moving through, and he's trying to celebrate the Lord in the tradition of the Israelites by dancing next to the Ark of the Covenant, which was a major cultural relic of the Israelites. A lot of mystery surrounding it, but I'm not going to get into that here. Okay, and now something worth noting is that the Israelites of this time looked nothing like the Israelis of modern-day society, the Orthodox Jewish culture. So we see the curly hair of the Orthodox Jewish culture. This has nothing to do with the Old Testament. This has nothing to do with the Torah. This tradition is something, some kind of, I don't know, it was invented because there's no way that people who are wandering in the desert without modern hair products would be able to curl their hair like that. There's no way. They would have just knotted up their hair into dreadlocks, and that's what the locks of hair on Samson, on a lot of these biblical figures. We have one of King David's son by the name of Absalom, who was reported to have cut his hair because it became so heavy. That would be, dreadlocks get pretty heavy. They capture dirt, bugs, all of the hair follicles that typically fall out as a part of just natural process of your hair shedding and regenerating. It captures all of that, and dreadlocks become very heavy, much heavier than regular hair. So we have a lot of different evidence of, the ancient Israelites being a kind of nomadic, dreadlock-wearing culture. That's what the ancient Israelites were. They were a nomadic, psychedelic-eating, dreadlock-wearing, tribal culture that moved around in tents for about 40 years until they eventually started capturing different cities and towns in the region of Canaan, which was part of northern Saudi Arabia, into Israel, up through Syria. And they established this whole government in that region, all because Moses led them out into the wilderness and started this tradition. So, all right, so that's the basis of the Judeo-Christian tradition. There's other stuff in there, but this is the basic stuff, okay? Yeah, there's lots of verses of Manna. You can read them, and you can read through the Old Testament with this awareness, and you can kind of see things a lot differently. That it's a kind of chronicle of this nomadic culture and how they conquered Canaan, the city of Canaan. Now, there should be something said about the advantages of taking psychedelics. So what do psychedelics do? Psychedelics do a lot of different things. But, we see in ancient Viking culture that there's this berserker warrior archetype, which is the warrior that ingests psychedelic mushrooms and goes on a rampage in battle. These warriors who would ingest these mushrooms to kind of work themselves into a frenzy before battle, and that it would channel the gods, and this whole mythology behind it. I mean, the people of Israel who were taking these substances would have had some kind of physiological, chemical advantage in combat against the standing armies of the Canaanites. If they had any fighting to do, they would have quicker reaction time. They would be more able and willing to attack their enemies because of the state of central nervous system arousal that these drugs put you in when you take them. It's like sex arousal, but it can also be channeled into fighting, into competitive energies. So the Israelites would have had a massive advantage after wandering in the wilderness, taking these drugs for 40 years, altering their consciousness, entering into states of group mind and communication with their local tribes and their friends and family. They would have developed these very close bonds because of the ordeals that they went through with these drugs together as a whole, and would have had very good communication after taking these drugs, because they would have experienced all kinds of psychotic episodes, and they'd have to explain it, and they'd have to have understanding and consensus amongst each other, and they would have been very much verbose in communicating during this, and this is probably a big part of why the kind of legal heritage of the Jewish community is that they had this rich psychedelic history in their early history that kind of that spun them. And this culture just always stayed with them, even though the psychedelics left. There was always this kind of legalizing, this kind of communication, this putting into word sensibility within the community of the people of Israel. That's never left the Jewish population, even though that they've kind of lost the origin of why that happened. The psychedelics influenced all of that neurological activity. The psychedelics brought that about, whereas without that, they might have just been conquered by the Canaanites and said, look at who are these pests on our borders, A big reason why the Israelites also conquered the Canaanites is because there was a kind of governmental collapse happening in the region at the time. There were, proxy governors from Egypt and other civilizations that were governing those territories, and they would call back to Egypt for aid to fight against the Israelites, but these governors would, but they wouldn't get anything. They wouldn't hear any word back from these people, and so they'd have to flee, and they'd have to leave, and people, so there'd be no standing militaries really to fight against the Israelites. And when there were, it was a tough contest, because there's stories of the battles, and we have David taking down Goliath in competition. There's several different war stories from the Old Testament that I'm not getting into for the sake of time. Okay. All right, so that's the Judeo-Christian tradition. So what we're seeing here is the building of a nature-worshipping religion, a psychedelic nature religion, right? That's what we're seeing. It's, once you see these connections, you're starting to see this. Now we see the same thing happen in Islam, and I'm going to show you exactly why that is. All right, so what we have to understand about Islam before we get started in this is that a lot of people in the West do not understand how to study Islam. They don't understand the mindset and the mentality of the time, and so they're trying to interpret this doctrine as if it was revealed, or not revealed, but just even preached today. It was preached in a totally different set of social circumstances. And if you're not studying the historical data around Islam, you're not going to get any insight from studying it. And there's a lot to be said about the kind of personal flaws of Muhammad, and that's a video for another time, and I'd be happy to get into that with people. But we're going to put that aside. We're going to focus on the subject that I'm addressing here for now. But in the future, I'd be happy to address it, really. Because there's a lot of evidence that shows that a lot of these criticisms that people are leveling against Muhammad are actually wrong. They're not, according to the Hadith and what we see in the historical literature. They're fabrications designed to promote a kind of xenophobic ideology. That's my view of it. If you actually study what actually happened in Islam, you can see that this was an authentic revolutionary movement of the underclass in the region against basically the slaveholders in the city of Mecca. That's what happened in Islam. This was whatever madness you want to attribute to the Muhammad. It's argued. There's a lot to be argued in the case of Muhammad as kind of being a much better person than we frame him in the West. He was probably much better, and that would make sense, because why would a billion people follow somebody who's a ravenous murderer? That's not who Muhammad was. I'm talking about Muhammad. I'm not talking about the people who came after him. There were a lot of ravenous murderers who took up the name of Islam as a means to gain power in the region. That's a different story, but we're going to get into this quickly. So when you study the Quran, what you have to know is that the Quran is not a doctrinal codex. Okay? The Quran is a poetic work of art. It is not a doctrinal codex. It is a collection of fables and myths that are saying, and there's a rhyme scheme and a meter to these verses. It's not like the Bible. It's not at all like the Bible. It's a completely different kind of text. Completely different. So if you're studying it as a doctrinal codex, you're actually studying it the wrong way, and you're not going to get any insight from it, because that's not how it was designed. So you have to study it as a work of art. You have to study it as an art historian. That's how you study the Quran. That's how you study Islam, and you actually understand what was being said, because all of it was designed as an artistic form of communication, not a doctrinal form of communication. That's how it was designed. Okay. So in Arabic, when you read the Quran, you're seeing a lot of layers of meaning. Okay. Now, and Muhammad was known to have invented a lot of words. There were a lot of words that Muhammad created that weren't around before he said them. So it was very much an artistic and a creative endeavor, and it was something that he would just get inspired. He would get what he called a divine revelation. He would get this inspiration to sing these tunes, essentially, and people would record them because they thought they were so poetic, so beautiful, and so concise, and framed the history of the region in such a concise and clear way, and it had a kind of ethical and moral sense to it, that people thought this is a great, like, kind of unifying, like, work of art that our culture can kind of form itself around. And so that's what the Quran is. It's the recordings of, they would have had mics and laptops recording his singing voice if it was today's world. But back then they didn't have that technology, so obviously they're not doing that. So that's what the Quran is. The Prophet Muhammad was more like a rock star than he was like a priest. He was not. He was, he had many wives. He loved sex. He loved women. He loved, my opinion, he loved taking drugs. That's my opinion. I'm going to get into that. So it was a very different, Prophet Muhammad was very much different than how people are framing him. He was not a warlord. He was an artist. That's who the Prophet Muhammad was. And he was even funny at times. He was very funny. He was a real person, and he was really like kind of the most kind of socially advanced person of his community, which, granted, it's not saying a lot because that community was very depraved. The Meccan community at that time was burying their daughters. They had slaves. They wrote the most decadent and depraved poetry. They were very decadent society, but Muhammad was very exceptional because he saw through the cultural facade of his time, and he kind of developed this kind of universality about the way that he perceived humanity, and that stuck with people. I mean, for 1,400 years till today, people still resonate with what he was saying, to the extent that people form entire governments around what he said. Okay, so this is important to understand. So again, these moments of revelation, this was poetic inspiration. That's what this was. Okay, it was, and he may have been intoxicated while he was going through this. We have verses in the Quran that say, "Don't get more intoxicated than you can handle." It's not saying don't get intoxicated. Just don't get too intoxicated. Don't get pissed drunk. That's what the Quran says about drugs. It doesn't say don't take drugs. It says don't get too intoxicated. It's pretty interesting, man. As a branch of the Abrahamic tradition, this makes sense. Once you get into it, we're gonna go further. So when we look, I'm gonna just get to the big argument quickly, and then we're gonna come back and do a few things. So in Sahih Muslim, which is a hadith, we have a saying of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, this is not the Quran. This is information outside of the Quran that was recorded by other scholars, sometimes many years after he had passed away. And there's a system for verifying and validating how credible the personalities are who are recording this information. So there's some difference in how you dissect and analyze this tradition between Shias, Sunnis, and other sects, but there's a way that you can kind of really get a relational understanding of people around Muhammad, and you can kind of understand, like, okay, this person wouldn't have lied about Muhammad. Okay, this person might have lied about Muhammad. And so you can kind of discover through historical analysis what was actually being said at the time. So this verse is very important. So we have Book 23, number 5084. Zayd B. Okay, so several people reported through this chain that I heard Allah's apostle, may peace be upon him, as saying, truffles are a kind of manna, and their juice is a medicine for the eyes. Truffles, okay, meaning mushrooms, are a kind of manna, and their juice is a medicine for the eyes. There's another verse. Truffles are a kind of blessing, and their juice is a medicine for the eyes. But really, manna here, this is the right translation. This is the one that's majority of, there's several different verses here, and most of them say manna. Okay? So my view is that the Prophet Muhammad discovered the botanical identification of manna by his relationship with one of the Syrian priests of the Christian church, that he discovered either now Muhammad was a trader, so he traveled to Syria to trade goods and to make a profit and to come back and bring that profit back to Mecca, and that's how he made his living. He married a very wealthy woman from whom he inherited a lot of wealth and was able to trade and perform mercantile functions in Mecca. And that's what Mecca was. Mecca was a mercantile city. People would stop there to kind of pay respects to the Kaaba, or the house of God, which was built theoretically by Abraham and his sons. And so people from all the different monotheistic faiths in the region would all come and gather around this building, and would kind of pay their respects, and they'd trade and they'd eat and they'd live there for a little bit, and then they'd go on. So it was kind of a touristy destination of its time. And that's where Muhammad lived for most of his life. So he would have communicated with people from every walk of faith in the monotheistic tradition. And likely there were some small cults that survived that preserved the manna tradition, even though the Israelite tradition was lost as kind of a wholesome entity because of the destruction of the Israelite state by different forces. So there was probably a kind of psychedelic underground also at that time that was present in the form of cults, and they would have had access to the Old Testament scriptures, and they would have been able to read and identify, just as I have done with you in this video, manna as something that as the psychedelic mushrooms. If they would have encountered psychedelic mushrooms in nature and they would have read the Bible, it would immediately click, like, this is the manna. This is what they were talking about in the scripture. So even if they didn't know what it was, but they knew the scriptures, anyone would be able to tell. And keep in mind, the marketplaces back then didn't have systems of regulation that we have now. You could sell drugs, you could sell these things, and there was no laws really regulating their sale unless you were in maybe an empire like Rome at the time. There's really very little restrictions on trade in those days, because you just couldn't administratively enforce them. As long as you weren't, being violent and totally causing a scene and being intoxicated to the point of making a fool out of yourself in the country that you were in, people wouldn't be any of the wiser. So Muhammad was traveling to Syria with massive amounts of money and making all kinds of relationships with traders of all kinds of goods from all over the world. Syria was a hub from the Far East to Europe, and goods would travel through Syria and go all over the world. So he was at this kind of hub where all this cultural mixing was happening, and also in Mecca, where there was a kind of cultic environment revolving around the Abrahamic tradition. So it's obvious to see that he would have easily figured out what manna was with all of these conditions coming into alignment. It's obvious to see that he would have easily figured out what these psychedelic drugs are, and their relationship to the monotheistic tradition of Israel and of Moses. So he would have become fascinated by this. He wasn't literate, so he couldn't read, but he would have spoken and communicated with a lot of people from a lot of different walks of life in his lifetime. And he was noted to be a very curious person. He totally embodies the anthropological archetype of the shaman. The personality of Muhammad is very enigmatic. He's very shy. He's very quiet for his early life. He's not overly outspoken for as a young man, he's in a tribal society. He doesn't have any parents. He grows up an orphan. He's trying to skate by through life, and he's trying to understand, how he can make a good life for himself. And he's looking at all the possibilities that are around him and how he could maybe elevate his own people out of these blood feuds that were plaguing the region, out of these practices of burying their own daughters, out of the decadence of holding slaves and treating them very badly, and just this kind of egoism this materialistic egoism that was prevalent among the ruling class in Mecca at the time. And there's all kinds of records about it, and that's something that if you want to study Islam, I encourage you that you can spend a lifetime in this literature and never get to the bottom of it. It's a bottomless pit. It really is. There's so much information recorded about Islam. And you can read it for yourself. If you don't believe what I'm telling you here, you read it for yourself and figure it out. That's what I did. And so anyways, so what we are seeing is that Muhammad discovered this tradition. Okay, and what is the first verse of the Quran? The first verse of the Quran is an encounter that Muhammad has with the angel Gabriel in a cave outside of Mecca, away from everyone else. What is this? This is the archetype of the shaman figure that's prevalent across the world. A person who goes into seclusion away from his community to think, to meditate, and oftentimes to take drugs. As is common in South America and even in the Rusic shamanic tradition, there is this seclusion, this getting away from the world, and this kind of turning inwards that happens with these characters. And Muhammad anthropologically totally resembles the shamanic archetype, 100%. The first verse of the Quran is him being instructed by an angel who comes and communicates and speaks with him and says, read this word, read the word of God, is what essentially this angel says. And the angel is kind of triggering this linguistic activity in his mind this is an archetypal portrayal of what psychedelics actually do to the mind. Psychedelics trigger cognitive activity, right? So there's this feeling of like reading and of scribing. There's this, but Muhammad can't read, so this revelation, this psychedelic experience comes to him as very shocking and very disturbing. Okay, and he's saying basically, the angel's basically saying, go forth and tell people about God. Go forth and tell people about the divine intelligence in the universe, and that you are experiencing right now as I'm standing here telling you this. This is what the angel Gabriel, as personified in the mind of Muhammad, is saying to him. He's communicating some divine message, okay? And this notion of angels or of entities coming and speaking to you, this is what the psychedelic experience is. So Muhammad is going through a psychedelic experience in the cave where he had his first revelation. That's what happened in Islamic history. The entirety of Islamic history, Judeo-Christian history, is the history of people taking psychedelic drugs and becoming kind of authority figures. That's the entire history of the Abrahamic tradition. That's what's happening. And these psychedelic drugs transform these communities and these people into nature-loving, egalitarian, socially distributed societies where there is not really a very strong hierarchical structure of order. Everything is done by the will of God, by some force of nature, right? People are given their freedom, and you have a kind of priest class that kind of leads and directs the society forward and gives them kind of an agenda and kind of frames like what they can accomplish. But they're not. It's not a kind of like command and conquer kind of religion. That's not what the Abrahamic traditions are. They were a consensus tradition. These people arrived at to these religions by consensus, and ultimately what happened with Muhammad is that he ended up converting a lot of people towards his kind of psychedelic cult, because the truth of the matter is that those people were totally depraved, and they were running themselves into the ground with their greed, and they were kind of really ruining the quality of life of everyone in the city of Mecca. The administration that governed the city was just the wealthy traders who would go to Syria just like Muhammad, but they were very antagonistic against Muhammad in the early days. And so these stories that you hear of raiding caravans and doing all of this stuff, I mean, there's a possibility that this stuff definitely happened, but keep in mind, like, the people who owned those properties were known to be extremely cruel people. And, you know, people who would kill slaves for their religious beliefs, you know, which is essentially just saying that we are all equal. You know, that's what the whole doctrine of Islam, of Judaism, of Christianity is. It's that everyone is equal, that we are all equal in the eyes of God. No one's better than anyone else. It's the dissolution of egoism. That's what religion is. And the egoism of any culture of any time does not like this proposition at all. It fights brutally against anything that says that that goes against the doctrine of a supremacy and authority that these egoists have constructed, whether it's along racial lines or cultural or tribal lines. It doesn't really matter. Any kind of doctrine that says, hey man, we're all equal, nobody's better than anyone else, it pisses egoists off, because it challenges their whole identity. It challenges everything that they believe about themselves. And that's what Islam did, and that's what authentic religion does. It brings you to humble yourself and realize you're not better than anybody else, right? That's what the message of Islam was. And the only reason that there was so much warfare in early Islamic history is because the confederation of traders who ran the city of Mecca, essentially, they decided that they were going to kill Muhammad, and they were going to kill the people that followed him. Muhammad was not the first person to engage in combat. It was because an assembly of about 2,000 men were brought to kill Muhammad and his followers, which were about 250 at the time, that they decided to fight back, and they ended up, a force of 250 Muslims ended up beating these 2,000 Confederate soldiers of the Arab Confederacy. And it's a pretty profound moment in history where you kind of see the zeal and the faith of these people, and like their will for self-defense give them this kind of religious mystique. After this battle, lots of people started converting to Islam, and that community started growing and growing and growing. And eventually they conquered all of the Arab tribes in Saudi Arabia, not because they went out and waged war against them, but because they were gaining a kind of social influence that made the egoists in that region very uncomfortable, because they felt, and they rightly so, that this religious doctrine was a challenge to their authority and their identity as tribal people, most of whom worshipped pagan gods that were, not to say that paganism is inherently bad, I don't necessarily believe that, but they worshipped like material objects, and they had this idolatry, and this turning away from the inward life, this turning away from the principles and from logos and from ethics, caused them to become very depraved, and they could justify doing anything in the name of their God. And we have the same kind of idolatry today. We just have like nations that we idolize. We have these entities of race and these other constructs that we idolize, that are not a part of just like the genuine nature of man. So we see in Islam there is a big emphasis on nature in Islam, which is worth noting. So the Quran and the Hadith mention a lot of different things, but we'll get into a few. There's the fasting of birds, which is alluded to as a kind of poetic thing, like imagining the fasting of birds and how they kind of starve themselves, but they're light as a feather and they just kind of move freely throughout the world. It's very poetic the way that it's worded in the Arabic and Quran. And there's astrological events, suns and moons, and all of this stuff. The meaning behind the barking of dogs, like braying of camels, braying of donkeys. There's like meaning when animals become agitated at night. It's because like the spirit is moving through the community. And animals are just more sensitive to these things, so there was a lot of talking about that. It's maybe a little bit superstitious, but there was probably something to that where animals are picking up on these psychic energies more so than we are. There's instructions for praying for rain. There is stories of Muhammad's wife caring for stray animals, giving them water and food. There's praying for animals, which is a big part of the tradition. Before they are slaughtered, you pray for the animal that you're going to kill. This is very reminiscent of like a Native American like tradition of like, you know, killing an animal with respect and dignity and respecting the life of that animal. It's very important within the Islamic tradition to this day. To this day, the prayers are said for the animals before they are slaughtered. And, you know, it's much better than what we have in mass agriculture, where the animals are just routed through these machine environments and killed by machines without any care for their well-being and the quality of their life while they're alive. And there's another instance where upon entering the city of Medina for the first time, a crowd was gathered to greet Muhammad, and he just kind of like let go of the reins of his camel and just kind of let it wander around amongst everybody. And there's a moment there where, you know, people were just kind of celebrating, and he just let the animal kind of do what it wanted to do. And it's a very free-loving, free-flowing religion. That's the essence of Islam. The only reason that there's so many battles is because there was a lot of tribal feuds in that region that were very difficult to resolve, and because of corruption that would happen later after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Okay, and that's a whole different video. But it's pretty interesting. What happened after Muhammad died, the whole of his tradition was basically defaced. And you know, because we see in Muhammad giving prescriptions like if you go into a city, do not kill people recklessly. Obviously, this was violated in Khaybar. But there's a whole argument about why that happened and what the consequences of that were, which to me is very interesting, but I'm not going to get into it right now. But generally, you wouldn't cut down trees, you wouldn't kill people needlessly. That was not acceptable amongst the Islamic community because it was a very pro-human, pro-life ideology. And you know, we have records of Ali, who was one of the most notable warriors and kind of priests who wrote some interesting literature too of Islamic tradition, where Ali is always, before he goes into a battle, he says to his opponent, and usually he would engage in duels with the best soldiers of the opposing army, and he'd say before his duel, he says, "There's no reason for you and I to fight. You know, all you have to do is just admit that there's one God and that we're all equal." That's what, it's termed accept Allah, but that's what was meant by Ali when he said this. Accept Allah and accept what Muhammad is saying. We are all equal. No one is better than anyone else. That's what the message was of Islam. That's what they were saying. Okay, and it wasn't that you have to accept Allah and the authority of Muhammad to, and you always have to submit to him and do whatever he says. That's not necessarily what was meant. That wasn't the intention of what was being said. The intention was always accept that we are equal in the eyes of God. That was always what was being said or being intended. In those early days, again, the message got corrupted. After the death of Muhammad, you started seeing these kind of jihads going through into Iran, to the Persian Empire, into Syria. Conquest by bloodshed that was not in alignment with the tradition of Muhammad. And this is where the Shia-Sunni divide emerges at the end of the Islamic tradition. When at the end of the Prophet's life is when the Sunni caliphs take over, and the Shia do not recognize these caliphs as being legitimate in the eyes of Islam. They are not religious leaders. They are leaders that are from the same Arab egoism that Muhammad fought against for his whole life. They are doing the same thing that Muhammad fought against. And many of the leaders of these Sunni caliphs were people who fought against the early Muslims and fought against Muhammad in battles, and ended up converting later as a means of gaining political status and power within Muhammad's dynasty, essentially. So their intentions were not pure. They were only using the name of Islam as a means to gain material power over the world. They didn't accept the doctrine of equality, of universality. They did not accept it. They thought themselves superior to everyone else, and they thought they were the royals. They thought they were destined to rule. They thought they were meant to rule, and that is not the doctrine of Islam. The doctrine of Islam is that everyone is equal. Muhammad is the leader of the Islamic community because he is the most egoless. He did not have a tribal identity. He did not have these notions that he was superior to the people who were following him in any way. He was only just trying to preach an egalitarian message. And the reason why he was successful is because he was authentic and because people loved him. That's why he was successful. He wasn't successful because he coerced people. It's because people genuinely loved him as a man. They thought he was a good person and that he was looking out for the interests of people who were not fortunate enough to have tribal status and all of these things that the ruling elites had in the city. So Muhammad was trying to create a society and a civilization that worked for everyone, not just the elite. And there's a lot to be learned from this tradition because of that, because Muhammad led a successful revolution against a ruling elite that saw itself as superior to everyone else. I mean, does it sound familiar? Are we not living with this today in the modern world? Do we not have a ruling elite that believes that they deserve to rule over us? It's what it seems like, That's what, with this condescension from all of these political figures, speaking ill against anyone of the Islamic faith, speaking ill against really anybody who recognizes this religious tradition that I'm sharing with you here today, that we are all equal, that no one is better than anyone else. Anyone who recognizes that as the core tenet of the Judeo-Christian tradition is ignored by the public and by the media. This is something that has to be dismantled. This false ideology has to be destroyed in order for human civilization to make its ascension through the technologies and through science. In order for us to thrive, we need to address the issue of supremacy, particularly as it relates to, one, the ideal of white supremacy and Jewish supremacy. These issues are the single most dangerous and malicious forces that exist within Western civilization. Because they are not founded on any kind of religious or historical tradition that has been successful. They are founded on the same failed ideas of the Confederacy that fought against Muhammad. They are founded on the same ideals of the Egyptian government that kicked the Israelites out of Egypt, out of a kind of misplaced xenophobia. These governments are always on the brink of collapse once they adopt these xenophobic, elitist ideas. Always. So that's what we're seeing today. I'm not advocating for jihad. I'm not advocating for anything like that. What I'm advocating is for a recognition of these texts, that we are all equal, that nobody is better than anyone else. That is what I am advocating for. It's very simple. There's nothing hard to understand about this. That, and if you need some help with it, take the psychedelics. Take the psychedelics, just like Muhammad did, just like Jesus did, just like David did, just like Solomon did, just like Moses did. If you're really a religious person, do what they did. I'm making a call towards religious fundamentalism that is essentially nonviolent, but that also brings a person towards a more authentic awareness of what their traditions are actually about. You see, these drugs trigger an awareness of nature, of the true chaos of nature. And, we try and create all these systems of order and government and state and society. But really, the only systems of governance and society that actually function and work are distributed systems, where everyone has a little bit of personal autonomy and contributes to a greater whole on the basis of consensus. These are the only successful societies that create art, civilization, culture, architecture, science. Only these civilizations that behave in this fashion create anything of value and create any kind of lasting legacy. So that's what we need to return to. That's what we need to become. We need to return to these traditions, and it's explicit in these texts that, look, the Israelites, the early Christians, the apostles very likely, John is a good example, Muhammad and other Gnostic traditions, the Mandaeans have evidence, even the Zoroastrian cult, the Magi of the Zoroastrians, all of these Gnostic groups were all ingesting psychedelic drugs. And the entirety of our religious heritage on this planet has a foundation in these drugs. Why? Why is that? There is important information to be gleaned from taking these drugs and experiencing what these people experienced in antiquity. Because these drugs catalyzed social forces that forged empires and created cultures. That's what these drugs can do for us today. This isn't just some useless academic exercise. By taking these drugs and listening to the experience that we get from them, we can learn things about nature itself. We can excite the cognitive and spiritual forces within the human being, and accelerate ourselves towards new art, new technology, new science that alleviates us from the oppressive structures that we have created. The oppressive structures of government, of information administration, of everything. I mean, all of these issues related to censorship on YouTube and all of these popular applications are all related to this cultural virus that we have in the West. And it is a virus of top-down authoritarianism, pyramidal, hierarchical structures. What we need is a revival of distributed governments and distributed societies. Blockchain is not a coincidence, okay, that it is emerging at this technological moment, okay? Look at the people in Silicon Valley. Look at these programmers. They are all psychedelic heads. These people are not just, taking drugs as a form of kind of debauchery and degeneracy. These people are taking these drugs because they cognitively become enhanced by them. A lot of these programmers, look at Steve Jobs, these people are performing a religious function for our society. They are creating the framework of our future governments. In the Bible we have cryptic sayings like, in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God. Right? So everything that we say, everything that we speak, it doesn't even belong to us. It's the property of some kind of super intelligence that composes the entirety of nature. And we just kind of do some back and forth with language, but ultimately we don't actually control language. We don't control really anything. We just kind of swim in in the soup of the cultures and of the history that we have. And the problem is that we are losing our awareness and our education of what has happened in history. We are losing this kind of analysis that goes through primary texts and analyzes things in a manner that is respectful towards who these people were and tries to understand things through their eyes, the way they understood it, not through our own biases. We have a very big problem with cultural bias in our country and in Western civilization as a whole, and we need to get rid of it because it's blinding us, and it's making us blind to the solutions that are going to alleviate the entirety of the planet from our collective suffering, which is inherently meaningless. It doesn't, it's like there's not like this struggle and we're fighting for. It's just meaningless. It's just meaningless suffering that's happening because there is more than enough wealth, technology, and human capital and resources for our society to function so smoothly with very little work input because of the automation of everything that of all of our industries. There is a potential for a greater distribution of power and wealth in Western civilization that would free the creative energies of humanity. And, we're seeing people like Andrew Yang, we're seeing these people emerge on the global stage that are addressing these issues and saying, look, man, why are we living like this? We are so rich. We have so much technology. We don't have to live like this. And that is the message, essentially, that psychedelics give to us. It's that you don't have to do everything. You just have to be one part of a distributed whole. That's the message of psychedelics, and that's the message that we need to reclaim. This rampant individualism and egoism is killing our culture, and it's killing our society. Because you, as an individual, there's very little a person can do to change things, and to even take care of themselves. You can't do anything unless you are part of a greater whole that has a cohesive sense of ethics and fairness, and that, there's a sense of like, if I trade with you, you're not going to rip me off, and there's a sense of fairness. The Islamic tradition does a great job of establishing rules for how that fairness gets established through mechanisms of halal and haram kind of qualification of different kinds of social interactions and different kinds of foods, and different kinds of transmission of information. There are things that we can draw from throughout history, not just Islam, but many other traditions, that can give us deep insight into why Western civilization is failing. So that's the gist of the message that I wanted to get across through this video. And I know it's a long ride and that it's very dense information, and I'm honestly surprised if any of you made it this far. But this is the awareness that needs to become mainstream amongst people. The time of hiding this information as an occult practice is over. It's over. We don't need to hide this. These substances have medicinal value. These substances have value, have cultural value. They inspire great creativity that inspires the advancement of the sciences. You just look at Steve Jobs again, for example. This is one example. There's a lot of people out there, though, who are like him, that are getting a lot of inspiration from the experiences that they have with these drugs. That being said, we shouldn't be giving them to children. This is for adults. This is a very adult subject, and you have to be educated about what you're getting yourself into, because these things can be very psychologically destabilizing. As we went through in the literature, the Israelites at times hated this stuff because it was very hard to handle. So you got to understand that this is a challenge. It is a challenge to integrate the understanding that these drugs can imbue on you if you have a curiosity, if you're trying to understand things. And and they give you great self-awareness. They give you self-awareness of like maybe ways that you're treating other people poorly. There's the entirety of our cognitive life is founded on the basis of these drugs. This goes into Terence McKenna's stoned ape theory, which I didn't even address this whole time because I was trying to focus on the religious stuff. But Terence was right about stoned ape theory. It's completely correct. And that is why these drugs have a huge place in our religions. It's because they are the catalyst that brought us from being primates into being human beings. And it gives us, these drugs are our connection to our primordial ancient history as biological life forms. They are crucial to our social stability and well-being. It's crucial that we can integrate these into our diet without becoming insane. So this understanding has to be made mainstream somehow. I don't know how it's going to be done because the systems of oppression and corruption that are in place now do not want this information to be made public. So that's why I made this video. I mean, I've been trying for many years to find other creative ways of getting this information to the public in maybe more presentable fashion, but in a more artistic fashion, ultimately. Working in music and in screenwriting, but because of how strange this kind of understanding is not only is it extremely difficult to work into art, but it's extremely difficult to work into art in a way that people can latch onto it. So that's why I'm making this video for all you truthers out there. Like, these drugs are not like, as a lot of people are saying out there on the internet, like, some MK Ultra operation. That's not true. Okay, man, like, it's just not true. Joe Rogan, Terence McKenna, Timothy Leary, all these guys who promoted these psychedelics, they may very well be and have been sponsored by the government, but they only did so as a means of avoiding legal prosecution against themselves for taking these drugs because they've been illegal. So the reason why they aligned themselves with the government is that, fuck it, I can take these drugs and continue doing my research on them without, while I'm getting a government paycheck, and I don't have to go to jail, or I can say, no, I'm not working for the government on principle, and, end up going to jail and being able to do no research on the subjects. It's obvious what choice they would take. They're going to take the government paycheck, obviously. Now, the government, the reason why they hired these guys, the reason that the government hired these dudes is because they thought that psychedelics could be used as a kind of distraction, like alcohol, like giving alcohol to people during the 1960s, during the cultural upheaval that was happening. They thought, let's get these drugs out to these guys so that they are incapacitated and they can't perform a civic rebellion. And in some capacity it worked, because LSD can be extremely disorienting. And even psychedelics, so taking too much of them can be very disorienting and destabilizing. So in some capacity it worked, but in another capacity, what we saw was immense technological innovation that has changed the landscape of power. And this, we see things like WikiLeaks emerging out of the internet. We see things, and that the internet and personal computers, this was all fostered in Silicon Valley by a lot of guys who were curious and fascinated by all kinds of things, not just computers. And a lot of these guys probably had these run-ins with these drugs like LSD and psychedelics, and these guys were the ones creating the interfaces that would be accessible to the general public. And they made the structures that the entirety of our information architecture would be built on top of. So it's, these drugs were a kind of Trojan horse into the system. So that's what Terence McKenna, Timothy Leary, Joe Rogan, if he is connected to the government, that's what they believe. That these drugs are the Trojan horse that is going to save our country. And they're doing it out of an ethical, inward sense of responsibility, out of a godly sensibility. You understand? Do you understand that? It's very clear. They are doing, it's religious. It's religious. What is happening with Joe Rogan, MK Ultra, Terence McKenna, what is happening with all of these events of modernity, that is the precursors of a neo-Israelite tradition That's what's happening with Joe Rogan. That's why he's the most watched podcast in the world, is because people sense a religious thing emanating from his show. That's why people watch. That because they want to see the religious revolution happen. Even if they don't qualify it as religious in their own terms, that's ultimately what they want. They want a totally egalitarian society where people are treated equally and fairly. No one thinks they're better than anyone else. People don't go to war against each other. There's no assassinations and bullets and guns and all of this craziness that our government has been perpetrating around the world for the past 100 years. So that's what people want. People want an era of peace, prosperity, culture, the arts, delicious food. This is what people want to experience in their life. They don't want to be dealing with economic depravity, war, starvation. They don't want to deal with this. But the problem is that our leadership structure lacks the insight into religious history, into the history of human beings, to understand how to govern and understand how traditional civilizations that were successful did govern. It was always in a distributed fashion, always, all the time. And look, I can ramble on continually about this, but that is the core of the message here. I tried my best to cite my sources here as I was explaining it to you, but you can share this video, go through the Bible, read Exodus, read the story of Moses as this kind of archetypal story of the shaman. Read the Quran and read the annotations. Try and understand what was happening at that time. Don't try and understand and look for things that you can criminalize and demonize, because you can find anything and put it in whatever context you want. It doesn't make it true. Now, if I get any response from this video, I will do a small video on why the criticisms of Muhammad are 100% completely wrong, and it's just pure idiocy. So that's what's up next. If you guys are interested, and this can turn into something big, you guys. If you can spread this video and you can do something with it, this can be something hugely extraordinary. Hugely. So with that, God bless you guys, and hopefully we can turn this sinking ship around.